Okay, so let's talk about blood glucose regulation. All right. So blood glucose levels are very important to the body. Um, Primarily, beyond the fact that your muscles use blood sugar to operate metabolism um, and keep you going. The biggest thing that your body always tries to do is preserve life over limb, and primarily that means feeding the brain, feeding the central nervous system. Okay, and the brain will only run on glucose. All right, it can also run on ketones, but that's kind of a last resort kind of fuel source. So the brain always wants sugar, as does your spinal cord, and your central nervous system runs on sugar. So maintaining an adequate level of sugar in the blood is very important. Now, as with most things in the body, there's this kind of Goldilocks principle going on where you can have too much or too little, and you just want to be just right. Okay, so if you have too much blood sugar, it damages tissue. It can damage nerves and blood vessels, and can lead to some pretty nasty implications to the body. If blood sugar drops too low, then the central nervous system doesn't get fed, and the brain isn't too happy about that. So the idea is you always want to have a constant regulated blood glucose. All right, and the endocrine system, one of the major things it does is to regulate blood glucose. All right, so there are five major hormones, which we'll talk about in this respect, are insulin, glucagon, catecholamines, growth hormone, and cortisol. All right, so if we look at this, insulin, I think we maybe talked about this a little bit. We'll get into it a little bit more. Glucagon, the way I always like to kind of remind people of this hormone, which isn't as common, gluco or gluca, having to do with glucose, and then gon. It's not exactly where the word comes from, but it's a good way to remember it. It comes about when glucose is low. Catecholamines, specifically, we'll talk about epinephrine, though norepinephrine, dopamine, or other catecholamines. Growth hormone and cortisol. I mean, these guys have to do with regulating tissue growth as well, but they do play a role in blood glucose. All right. So if we look at this, kind of jumble here of just different hormone levels, what we notice is during this is 3 hours of exercise. Glucose levels here in the blue are staying basically constant. So first off, we know this person's trained, or these people are trained that they did the study on. But then you look and you notice that epinephrine's going up. Here we have cortisol goes up, and then it kind of comes down. Glucagon goes up and kind of plateaus off here. Norepinephrine kind of staggers its way up, right? And it's not here, but growth hormone would kind of go up, and it would kind of ramp up toward the end there. So the reason I show you this, I want you to kind of realize that as opposed to other systems we've spoken about, the endocrine system is kind of difficult to put your finger on exactly what's going on. The reason being is there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of stuff going on. Okay, so in order to maintain this perfect flat, no change in glucose, you have these different time courses, these different changes in hormone levels. Okay, and your body is upregulating and downregulating these different hormones at different times throughout exercise, with the purpose of maintaining adequate blood glucose. Okay, it's a bit convoluted. All right, so let's look at how we maintain blood glucose. Okay, so I've mentioned a few hormones, but at the end of the day, those hormones are all they're gonna do is tell cells either to do either to take actions which would increase blood glucose levels or decrease them or maintain them. So there's four major ways this happens. Okay, first of which is mobilizing glucose from the liver. Okay, liver is a place where we store a lot of glycogen. Okay, so if you have a hormone that goes and tells the liver to release glucose out to the blood, well, that would of course increase blood glucose levels. Additionally, you can mobilize free fatty acids. Okay, so I want you to think about that. If you mobilize more free fatty acids, you're increasing the odds that, say, muscle will take and pull up that fat and use it instead of glucose. And if you do that, you're sparing blood glucose. You're sparing the blood glucose for the brain to use. Okay, so by increasing the amount of free fatty acid in the blood, you create more competition for the glucose, which spares it long term. All right, you can perform what's called gluconeogenesis. Okay, we've talked about this a bit before, but gluconeogenesis is creating new glucose from things like amino acids, lactic acid, glycerol, essentially creating amino acids from creating glucose from non-glucose sources. And your other thing that happens is some of these hormones will actually block the entry of glucose into cells. Okay, typically muscle cells. And that's a bit like when, if your blood glucose levels are getting low, some hormones can be released. The brain essentially is just shutting down competition. Okay, because it wants the glucose, and at the end of the day, the boss is going to get theirs. Okay, the brain's of course the boss. So if it needs to preserve glucose, if your body needs to preserve blood glucose, some hormones will actually stop the uptake into muscle cells, which then saves it for the brain. So let's start off our discussion with insulin. Okay, so insulin, of all the hormones we'll talk about, it's the only anabolic hormone. Okay, strictly anabolic. There are other hormones which are anabolic, but they also may have some catabolic aspects. In this discussion of blood glucose, insulin is the only purely anabolic hormone. Okay, and it stores. Okay, it's a storing hormone. When insulin hits the bloodstream, it reacts with various types of tissue, be it liver, muscle, or adipose tissue. You can see here in this figure. Okay, these various types of tissues, and depending on where the insulin meets up with its receptors, or whichever kind of cell it meets up with, it's just going to simulate storage of whatever is associated with those types of cells. So if insulin meets with an adipose cell or fat cell, it's going to stimulate lipogenesis, or creation of triglycerides. Okay, it's fatty acids plus glucose, glycerol. Glucose gets metabolized into fat, and you have storage of triglycerides. Plasma glucose, that can be pulled up by muscles. Okay, and that's going to create glycogen. And then plasma glucose can also be pulled up by the liver to create glycogen as well. So insulin is your prototypical storage hormone. This is the one where after you eat a bunch of food, you release a lot of insulin, and it tells the body to take up and store things. It's worth noting you also have an increased rate of protein uptake, which has been used by some people as a means of stimulating more muscle growth post-workout. So if we look at insulin and we examine how it is affected by exercise intensity, first off, it's important to note that insulin release is directly correlated with blood glucose level. Okay? So simply put, if insulin levels are high, it's because blood glucose levels are high. And if insulin levels are low, it's because blood glucose levels are low. So, as you start to exercise, say this is a percentage of VO2. So say you're ramping up into exercise from 0% to 100% of VO2 max. Okay? You notice blood glucose levels, say this is percent change here on the side. So it's resting. As you work at lower intensity, getting into moderate intensity, blood glucose levels are low, and that's why insulin levels are low. And as you start to increase intensity, you start going 80, 90, 100%, you actually see blood glucose levels start to rise again. And that's interesting, right? Because if you're working harder and you're using more carbohydrate, you would expect that you'd actually see a decrease, okay? But that increase is due to some of the other hormones we'll talk about moving forward. But when you see a change in insulin levels, it's directly tied to blood glucose. So if blood glucose is high, insulin is high. If insulin is low, it means blood glucose is low. Alrighty, so along that train of thought, we can see with trained versus untrained people. If we look here in red, trained people, insulin levels over time, this is over a little over an hour and a half of exercise, versus untrained in the blue here. And what we know of being more trained is that the more well-trained you are, the better you are at utilizing fats, right? So you're better able to preserve your blood glucose. Okay, with that in mind, when you look at this graph of percent change of insulin over time, we can see that the trained people don't lose as much blood glucose, and by extension, their insulin levels stay higher. Whereas an untrained person has a tendency to burn more blood glucose at all levels, at all points of this exercise, and therefore you'll notice that their insulin levels are lower as well because they're not able to keep their blood glucose levels as high during exercise. Alrighty, so let's move on to glucagon real quick. So, glucagon, as I said before, a good way to think about this hormone, just take the word glucagon. This is the hormone that's going to kick in when glucose levels are low, or when glucose is gone. Okay, both insulin and glucagon are produced by the pancreas. So it's it's interesting when blood glucose levels are high, insulin is produced. When blood glucose levels are low, glucagon is produced by the same organ. So it just shows you the kind of, like I said, the Goldilocks principle. Too high, insulin. If it's too low, glucagon. Alrighty, so glucagon, the way it reacts with the body. When glucagon meets up with fat tissue, you have the opposite of what happens with insulin. You have a lipolysis, or a breakdown of lipids, the release of free fatty acids, and that will increase the amount of fat in the blood, allowing you to have more access to that to burn it. Okay, when it meets up with the liver, you have a couple things happening. This is gluconeogenesis, so the creation of glucose, and also the breakdown of glycogen. So you have the release of glucose and creation of glucose are both upregulated. So with glucagon, you see, you actually have a direct release of glucose into the blood, and also a release of fatty acids, which are helping you to keep going to metabolize something other than glucose in an effort to try to maintain and increase glucose levels. So if we look at glucagon with the same time course as we saw with insulin, right? Not really time course, rather, but percentage of intensity, okay? Percentage of VO2 max. Um, if you remember before with insulin, it looked a little bit like this, right? With with intensity, you saw that blood glucose levels went down, and then they started to come back up again as we got toward 100%. Now look at this. You see plasma glucagon levels, they start to rise at this low to moderate intensity, and as we reach high intensity, their levels decrease. So, if we know that insulin levels go up with more glucose and they go down with more glucose, then by extension, quite the opposite, we can say that plasma glucagon levels follow the opposite course of action. Okay, so whenever blood glucose levels are high, you see in this case, at the beginning of exercise or toward the end of it, or sorry, toward maximal, um, when blood glucose levels are high, glucagon levels are low, and when glucose levels are low, then glucagon levels are high. Alright, and then we look at glucagon with trained versus untrained subjects. Look at percent change once again over the course of an hour of work. You see that trained people have almost no change in glucagon. Reason being is they're better able to maintain high levels of glucose in the blood throughout exercise. And if they can maintain a good steady level of glucose, then they don't have to tap into their glucagon. They don't have to release this hormone, which is there to liberate and release glucose in times of need. Okay, because over the course of an hour, they're not really dropping their blood glucose levels, whereas untrained people, over the course of the first half an hour, you see they have a pretty marked increase here, almost 65, say 70% change or increase in glucagon, which increases over time. And that is because untrained people use more blood glucose. They use more blood glucose, which means that they need more glucagon to keep flooding the system with more glucose. Alrighty, so let's look a little bit at catecholamines, or specifically epinephrine or adrenaline. Okay, so catecholamines, kind of a running joke, honestly, in physiology. You can kind of blame anything on catecholamines. Truth be told, basically anything that happens in the body, we could generalize back to epinephrine somehow. Um, it's kind of true, but anyway, so if we look at epinephrine specifically just for glucose regulation, we see that when it meets with the liver, it produces glucose from the breakdown of glycogen. So you have glycogenolysis. Okay, in adipose tissue, we have breakdown of fats or triglycerides, creating free fatty acids in the blood. And then at the tissue, you have a blockage of glucose uptake. Okay, so when you're getting a lot of catecholamine release, what you'll notice is blood glucose levels will rise up very fast. Reason being is all these things are helping to increase those levels. Alrighty. So beyond that, some other things that catecholamines do, one of which is to activate something called a fetal cycle. Okay, so fetal cycles, they are kind of what's responsible for your resting metabolic rate to a certain extent. Production of heat on a cold day. The reason your metabolism gets a little bit faster during the winter, it's a fetal cycle issue. So fetal cycles, it's what happens is in your cells, in your fat cells or muscle, there's a protein that can be produced called uncoupling protein. And anyway, what it does, it meets with the electron transport system, that metabolic system we've talked about, um, and it uncouples the production of ATP from the breakdown of substrates. Okay, essentially, all the steps that you go through to break down fat in order to produce ATP, at the very last step where you actually produce the ATP in that long chain of events, it it makes it so you don't actually produce ATP. Now, relevance to this, it basically just increases your resting metabolic rate. Okay, because you're burning substrates, you're burning fats primarily without producing anything. So you're just generating heat. This happens, like I say, when it gets cold outside, when you start to adapt to the cold, um, people start generating a bit more heat, just normally, and that is activation of fetal cycles. Some people are better at this than others. Some types of mammals are better at this than we are as humans. But anyway, that's another thing that epinephrine does, is stimulates fetal cycles. Okay, so beyond that, okay, so we've seen that there's glycogenolysis, there's lipolysis, there's um, increase in gluconeogenesis. Also, you have a stimulating decrease of glycogen synthesis. So when epinephrine hits your system, cells no longer, or rather, the urge to store glucose is downregulated. Okay, so you have a decrease in glycogen creation, which helps with keeping more glucose available. And then also, when catecholamines, when epinephrine meets with the pancreas, what you see is an increase in glucagon and a decrease in insulin. Okay, so what we know of glucagon is when you have more of it in your system, you're producing more glucose from the liver, right? And you're also having more free fatty acid production. When you have less insulin, you're going to be storing less. So you can see very clearly that when epinephrine is in your system, when you have a lot of it in your system, you're going to see an increase in blood glucose. And you see this mostly with high intensity work. If anybody's ever done, let's say, a CrossFit kind of workout, or run as fast as they could for a mile or something like that, you're going to see a lot of epinephrine release during high intensity work like that. All right, and the harder you work, as you approach maximal, you'll see exponential increases in epinephrine release. You'll get a lot of adrenaline in your system. Which is why some people, when they work really hard, they have kind of a fight or flight response. Um, it's a very real thing in some people. Um, and everybody kind of reacts a little bit differently to having that adrenaline rush. But what you see here is, like I say, exponential increase of catecholamine with increase of workload. Okay, so we have percentage of VO2 max here on both of these. This is norepinephrine and epinephrine. And you see at low intensities here, you're not producing too much. As you start working toward maximal, it becomes much, much higher. Okay. So another thing you'll notice with epinephrine or catecholamine release during exercise is over the course of exercise, over say an hour in this case, you have a linear increase in the amount of epinephrine being released. Now this is assuming that the same pace is being maintained throughout the exercise. If the pace is not being maintained, then you'll see fluctuations one way or the other. But if you're going, say, the same speed for an hour, you will have more and more epinephrine in your system. This is another reason why over the course of an hour, hour and a half of doing cardio, if you're going the same pace you will see a slight creep in heart rate. Heart rate's going to continually go up just a little bit. Okay, and also you'll see a slight increase in systolic blood pressure as well, because epinephrine has, of course, dramatic effects on cardiac output and cardiac mechanics. So that's part of the reason why you see that. And if we look at epinephrine release during exercise, this graph's kind of cool. It goes over epinephrine right here on the y-axis, and we have time on the x-axis. Okay, at different intensities of work. Okay, so different intensities, how much epinephrine is being released, and we're going to relate this to glycogen in a second. Okay, so if we look at this, working at moderate intensity here, low to moderate, 40 to 55-ish%. Okay, almost no epinephrine. Epinephrine levels don't really increase too much. As we increase intensity to more of a moderate level, then we have a much greater slope. As we start approaching more vigorous intensities, the slope becomes much more steep. And if we work at maximal or supramaximal, epinephrine levels skyrocket. Okay, so supramaximal would be more doing anaerobic work. So take this, and I'm gonna move on to the next slide. The next slide is going to show us what happens with various intensities to our glycogen levels. Alrighty, so here we have, like I said, we have glycogen depletion here on the y-axis, time on the x, and these numbers here are percentage of VO2 max. So at lower intensities, this is 30% of VO2 max. Glycogen doesn't really deplete. Okay, 60% depletes faster, 75 faster, 90. Pretty steep drop, and then within 30 minutes you're depleting pretty quick. And working at 120%, you don't last more than a few minutes. Okay, so the relevance of this, when we look at these things, when we look at them back to back, what you notice is the rate of release of epinephrine directly mirrors the depletion of glycogen. Okay, well, I'll go back here just so you can see this. Okay, so think about this. Look at this graph right here, and just we're going to have to kind of flip it. Okay, but as intensity increases, epinephrine release increases, and there we go. Glycogen depletes really fast, right? As you work at 75%, say, it's a pretty steep decline in glycogen. And here we go. When you work at somewhere around here, you'd wager that it would be somewhere like this. Okay, the slopes are kind of the same. All right. The reason I'm taking the time to talk about this is that you need to realize that epinephrine is probably the most potent determiner of the hormones we'll talk about that determines how fast you deplete your glycogen levels. Okay, so if you have a lot of epinephrine in your system, you're going to have a lot of glucose hitting the system as well, because it's a very potent stimulator of increasing blood glucose level. All right, let's look at growth hormone. Okay, so growth hormone, you guys are probably more familiar with this from the perspective of tissue growth, building muscle, all that sort of thing, baseball, what have you. But growth hormone actually plays a role in regulating blood glucose as well, right? So when growth hormone interacts with the liver, you have gluconeogenesis occur. Okay, so at the liver, take amino acids, glycerol, things of this sort, and producing glucose. So you have an upregulation of gluconeogenesis. In the fat tissue, you have an upregulation of lipolysis, so more breakdown of triglycerides, creating free fatty acids for the blood. And at the tissue level, at the muscle tissue, you're having a blockage of glucose entry to that cell. Okay, so that's how growth hormone interacts with cells to help increase blood glucose level. Now, what should be noted is growth hormone, as opposed to something like epinephrine, it's a more, we call it a more pervasive type hormone. It takes longer to kind of come on board. Okay, if you're working out for a short period of time, you won't have as much growth hormone, though it is tied to intensity to a certain extent. It's if you work out for a few hours, it'll increase over time, and over time it'll go up quite markedly. But in the beginning, you're not going to have a lot of growth hormone release, right? Growth hormone kind of mirrors the effects of cortisol when it comes to time course in blood glucose regulation. Alrighty, so percent change in growth hormone. Alright, so with intensity, right, moving toward 100% here, you see over a 2,000% increase in growth hormone. Alright, so there's something to be said for working out at higher intensities. Specifically, this also relates to lifting weights as well. So working at higher intensities causes more growth hormone to circulate in your system. Now we're talking right now about blood glucose, but it's the same hormone that also stimulates protein synthesis, okay, or muscle building. So working out at higher intensities will flood your system with more growth hormone, thereby increasing your ability to build muscle. Okay, now that's just something to be thinking about whenever designing workout strategies. Alrighty, now with most of the hormones that we've talked about, it's been pretty simple, you know, as far as insulin or glucagon. If glucose is high, insulin's high. If glucagon if glucose is low, then glucagon is high. That sort of thing. Growth hormone doesn't exactly follow the same time course. Okay, it doesn't follow the same logic, so to speak. All right. If we look here at this graph, this is 1 hour of work, percent change of plasma growth hormone. All right, and you see we have control or untrained versus runners. Okay, now runners are going to be better at maintaining their blood glucose levels, but you see you still have more more growth hormone in the system. So this probably speaks to, over the course of an hour, a trained runner is going to work at a higher intensity, just from an absolute perspective, than will a control or an untrained person. So this speaks more to the fact that growth hormone release probably has more to do with the intensity of work than it does how much blood glucose is actually in your system. Okay, so it does increase over time in everybody, but that increase is not directly related to the amount of blood glucose that you do or do not have in your system. Alrighty, cortisol. So cortisol has a pretty bad rap, especially in the lifting world, and it has a lot to do with this right here, right there. So cortisol increases blood glucose levels in some of the same ways, but it is the only one that will cause muscle to go through a process called proteolysis, or breaking down protein. Okay, so when you have a lot of cortisol in your system, you're going to have more protein breakdown. Okay, and for those who are trying to build muscle, that's, heresy. So, but anyway, if you look at cortisol, you have the breakdown of muscle, which frees up amino acids. the breakdown of triglycerides, which frees up free fatty acid and glycerol. Okay, so free fatty acid can go right to the blood and be taken up by muscles. It also blocks the entry of glucose into cells. But the glycerol and the amino acids it creates also stimulate gluconeogenesis, which then gives us glucose production. Okay, so cortisol, and it does other things in the body, of course, not just regulating blood glucose, of course, but when it in this facet, cortisol will kind of break down whatever it finds and create substrates for that gluconeogenesis reaction to create more glucose. So that's how it contributes primarily. Right. So when we look at cortisol and how it relates to free fatty acids, we can look at this graph here. Okay, we have time here. This is 3 hours of work. Cortisol on the y-axis here, and then also on the y-axis we got free fatty acids. Okay, so free fatty acids are in the blue, red is cortisol. Okay, and as we've said before, cortisol has kind of a faster onset. And cortisol and growth hormone are two things that kind of work to help each other to a certain extent. They cover just different times within the course of exercise. So what happens here is cortisol initially peaks up within the first, say, half an hour of work, and then you'll see it just starts to decline here over the next couple hours. But you notice that fatty acids keep going up. Okay. Now this could probably be attributed to, one, the linear increase in epinephrine, right? Because epinephrine continues to go up over time. Also, you've got growth hormone, which follows kind of a course that looks a little bit like this, right? And then, depending if they're not well trained, they might have glucagon issues. So glucagon will maybe go up as well. So the reason that fatty acids are going up is probably due primarily to epinephrine and growth hormone. But it's just important to note that cortisol, as I said, it peters out early, and the hormone that's directly kind of linked to taking over the role of cortisol is growth hormone. So if cortisol goes down, the growth hormone kind of comes up like this, and they both stimulate a lot of fatty acid release, which provides you with substrates throughout exercise. So cortisol is kind of an interesting hormone. Okay, one of the things that cortisol does, and I don't touch on this too much, but cortisol plays a pretty big role in the immune system. Okay, so when cortisol, first off, pretty much all your immune system cells have glucocorticoid receptors, or they have receptors for that cortisol hormone. All right, and what most of you probably know cortisol as the effects of it is it's an anti-inflammatory, right? Because what happens is when an immune system cell binds with cortisol, or cortisol binds with that cell, it essentially inactivates the cell. So it stops immune system function, which by extension decreases inflammation, right? Because inflammation is an immune system process. So how does that relate to what I'm talking about? Okay, this isn't exactly blood glucose stuff, but it is kind of interesting with cortisol. All right, so if we look here, we have percent change, VO2, okay, so that's our x-axis here, 0 to 100. And then we have, percent change on the y-axis of cortisol, all right? So what we notice here is with exercise of low intensity, okay, you actually have a reduction in cortisol level in the body. When you exercise at high intensity, you have an increase in cortisol. Okay? So let's relate this back to relevance to you. Okay, we all know that doing low intensity work is calming, right? Doing something like yoga, um, going for a walk. It's a de-stressor, right? It's something that that will you know, provide you with a better sense of well-being. There's also studies out there that show that something like a 30-minute walk will actually increase your immune system function, make you more likely to fight off disease, less likely to get sick. And if we look at this graph, we can kind of see why. Because if we're working at 20 or 30% of VO2 max, we're decreasing cortisol. Cortisol actively shuts down your immune system function. Temporarily, but it does. And that is why when you work at really high intensities, you're more likely to get sick. And there's tons of work on this. There's a lot of studies that show this, that when people work out really hard, when they do a marathon, when they do an Ironman, when they do some sort of a very drastic exercise routine, their likelihood of getting sick is very high afterwards because their immune system has been suppressed, and that's a lot of the time that's cortisol related. Okay, but also think about around exam time, right? During really stressful situations, you may notice that you get sick more often, and the reason is it's cortisol. Cortisol is that stress hormone. So when you're feeling the weight of the world, when you have that, you know, mind's all over the place because you have so much to do and you're stressed, you typically have a lot of cortisol in your system, and that's going to um, make you more likely to get sick. So, an easy way to reduce that cortisol, one, is by sleeping. It's one way you can metabolize cortisol. Or two, work out at low intensities. Low to moderate intensity will actually decrease cortisol level and by extension reduce your amount of stress. Alrighty, so let's look at some quick training effects. Alrighty, so first off, as we said, trained people are better able to maintain their blood glucose levels than untrained people. Okay, this graph just kind of shows that. Okay, untrained people, you see decrease, 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 and then drop off. Trained people, if anything, that goes up a little bit. Okay, so that's what we notice. Now let's look at the different hormonal changes to stimulate that. Okay, so looking at plasma insulin in training, as we said before, insulin is directly related to blood glucose levels, right? And a trained person is better able to maintain their blood glucose, so we would expect that trained people are better able to maintain insulin as well, right? Untrained people, insulin levels are low because they're also losing their blood glucose. Okay? By extension, glucagon levels are inversely related to glucose. So if you're seeing very little decrease in blood glucose, you're not going to see a whole lot of change in glucagon versus a untrained person who has a large increase in glucagon because they're burning so much glucose as they're exercising. Alrighty, and one last thing I want to just touch on, and this is something that's actually really important, and it relates to epinephrine. So, training reduces catecholamine release. Okay, now, what do I mean by this? Why is it important? As we've seen with other hormones, we just saw a slide ago with insulin and glucagon, looking at how they relate to training and so whatnot. You have increases or decreases, and those things are typically tied to the actual amount of glucose that's in the system. But much like growth hormone, epinephrine is not necessarily tied directly to the amount of glucose in your system. Okay, and with more time of training, what you tend to see is a decrease in epinephrine release. Okay, so this was a study that was done, and they did the exact same thing, like running, say, same duration, same speed, all that sort of thing, over the course of 7 weeks. And initially, you had high epinephrine, then it was still high, and as they kept doing the same thing, you notice that epinephrine levels went down. Okay. Same with norepinephrine. But the relevance of this, it goes back to kind of all the other things that epinephrine does. Okay. But first off, the body, if it's just doing something for the first time, if it's being exposed to a brand new stimulus, you'll have a tendency to have what we call a mass activation. Okay. This. Okay. In this instance, the body doesn't know exactly how much epinephrine it needs, so it just overproduces. It produces way more than it needs. Okay, and that essentially the kind of the biological logic, if you will, is that the body would rather have too much glucose being produced than not enough. So when it's exposed to a new stimulus, you'll produce a lot of epinephrine, you'll get a big fight or flight response, and you'll be able to meet the substrate needs because you'll be liberating a lot of glucose. Okay, but as you start doing something over time, you start being able to kind of dial in the exact amount you need. Okay, and you see this over time, and this is relevant to a lot of different disciplines, a lot of both sporting events and real world occupations. Um, but essentially, with more training, with more repetition of the same task, that reduction in the amount of epinephrine also means you're going to have less facilitation, which means your motor activities will become more and more coordinated over time. Okay, and you can see how this might have relevance to, say, like a biathlon, the winter event where they cross-country ski and then they shoot. So during that cross-country skiing portion, they're producing a lot of epinephrine. And if you ever tried to fire a rifle or any sort of a bow or a firearm, you need a lot of precision. If your hands are jumping all over the place because you're highly facilitated, you're going to have a hard time being accurate. But with more training, you're better able to, not produce as much epinephrine, which means you're less facilitated, and those athletes can be more on target. Same thing can largely be said for military training. The reason that basic training is done the way it is to induce that fight or flight response in cadets, in trainees, so that when they're in a real world situation where they need to perform their actions adequately, then they've already been exposed to that. They don't produce as much epinephrine. They're more able to stay calm, that sort of thing. That's the idea, at least. So it is interesting that you have less catecholamine being released, and that's why whenever you do something over time, it stops being as much of a, for lack of a better term, a big deal. It becomes easier over time. You get less of a systemic rise from it. You get less fluctuation. Because your body essentially just gets dialed in and better at doing that one thing. So it doesn't need to have a mass activation. It can just produce only what it needs, no more. So you become more efficient.